The dust of the Arizona Territory was a living thing. It settled in the lines of Clara Hartwell's hands, clung to the hem of her worn denim skirt, and coated the back of her throat with a perpetual grit. It was the same dust that had claimed her brother, Thomas. Not a year passed. It had soaked up his blood and been stirred by the hooves of the Apache horses that rode away, leaving a silence on the ranch that had never truly lifted. That silence had seeped into her father, Colonel Hartwell, turning his grief into a hard, unyielding stone of hatred. The Hartwell Ranch, once a place of modest but determined hope, had become a fortress. The men her father hired were no longer just cowboys. They were soldiers in his private, undeclared war. They wore their pistols with a grim purpose, their eyes constantly scanning the jagged line of the mesas that shimmered in the distance. The town of Bristle Rock, just a half-day's ride away, had fallen in step with the colonel's bitter march. Whispers about the Apache, once tinged with a fearful respect for a formidable foe, were now laced with pure venom. They were no longer people. They were shadows, phantoms responsible for every spooked steer and every dry well. Clara moved through her days in a haze of duty. She mended fences Thomas had built, tended the vegetable garden her mother had planted before the earth took her, too, and managed the ledgers with a neat hand that belied the tremor she often felt inside. She was the ghost of her family's better days, a constant reminder to her father of all he had lost. He rarely looked at her, and when he did, his eyes seemed to pass right through her, searching for the son who was gone. The only time his gaze sharpened was when he spoke of the Apache. Then, a fire would light in their depths, a terrible, consuming blaze that frightened Clara more than any story of warriors in the dark. "They understand one thing and one thing only. Clara," he had said just last week, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle that now leaned permanently by the door. "Force. You show them anything else, and they see it as weakness. Remember that. Remember what they did to your brother." She remembered. She remembered the unnatural quiet of the house when the riders brought Thomas home. She remembered the sight of her father falling to his knees, a sound torn from his throat that was not human. But her memory was a tangled thing. She also remembered Thomas speaking of the Apache with a grudging admiration, talking of their skill with horses, their knowledge of the unforgiving land. Those were the memories she kept locked away, a secret treason against the hardened man her father had become. The supply run to Bristle Rock was a task Clara usually dreaded, but today it was a reprieve. The air in the ranch house was thick with her father's plans for a new patrol, which she knew was just a kinder word for a raid. The open air, even under the punishing sun, felt cleaner, freer. Her horse, a steady old mare named Daisy, plodded along, the wagon wheels grinding a familiar, rhythmic complaint against the packed earth. She had spent longer in town than intended. Mr. Henderson at the general store had held her up with questions about the ranch, his eyes full of a pity she did not want. The sky, a vast and indifferent blue when she arrived, had begun to bruise with angry purples at the edges by the time she started back. Out here, the weather turned with the speed of a striking rattler. The wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face and carrying the scent of rain and wet creosote. She was urging Daisy through a shallow arroyo, a dry wash that was little more than a wrinkle in the landscape most days. When the world changed, a low rumble vibrated up through the wagon floor, a sound she felt in her teeth. It grew louder, a deep-throated growl that was not thunder. Daisy's ears swiveled, and her head came up, nostrils flaring. Clara looked upstream. What she saw made her blood run cold. A wall of churning brown water, thick with mud and debris, was surging down the wash, a flash flood. They were a terrifying myth of the desert, a story told to warn greenhorns, but she had never seen one. It moved with impossible speed. "Go, Daisy, go!" Clara screamed, snapping the reins. The old mare, bless her heart, lunged forward, her powerful haunches digging into the soft ground. The wagon lurched, a wheel catching on a half-buried rock. The jolt threw Clara against the sideboard. The water was on them. It wasn't a gentle rise. It was a physical blow. A liquid fist that slammed into the side of the wagon. Daisy screamed, a high, terrified sound as the current tore at her legs. The wagon groaned, wood splintering, and then it began to tilt. Clara clung to the seat, the rain slipping through her wet, trembling fingers. The water was a roaring beast, clawing at her, pulling her down. It was icy cold and impossibly strong. The wagon tipped further, and she was thrown into the maelstrom. The world became a violent, suffocating chaos of brown water and spinning sky. She was tumbled over and over, her lungs burning for air. A heavy branch struck her leg, and a sharp, searing pain shot up from her ankle. She gasped, swallowing a mouthful of gritty water. Her heavy skirts were a leaden shroud, dragging her under. This is it, she thought. A strange calm settling over the panic. This is how it ends. Then, through the roar, another shape broke the surface. A horse, dark and powerful, fighting the current with a desperate strength. On its back sat a man, leaning low. His body one with the animals, he moved with a purpose that seemed to defy the chaos around them. Before she could process it, he was beside her. A strong arm, corded with muscle, circled her waist, hoisting her from the water with a force that knocked the last of the air from her lungs. He pulled her up, half sprawled in front of him on his horse. She coughed and gagged, spitting out mud and water, her body shaking uncontrollably. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the wet buckskin of his shirt. The horse fought its way toward the collapsing bank of the arroyo, its hooves finding purchase where there should have been none. With a final, heaving effort, they were out of the torrent, on solid, muddy ground. He did not release her immediately. He held her for a moment as the horse stood trembling, its sides heaving. Clara pushed her wet hair from her face and looked up at her rescuer. His face was stark, carved from the very rock and canyons of the territory. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth set in a grim line. His skin was the color of weathered copper, and his wet black hair was long, tied back at the nape of his neck. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, so dark they seemed to swallow the gray light of the storm, and in their depths there was a stillness that was both unnerving and profound. They held no warmth, no pity, just a quiet, assessing intensity. And in that moment, as she took in the cast of his features and the unspoken history in his face, she knew. He was Apache. The realization was a second jolt, as shocking as the cold water. Everything her father had ever said, every story whispered in town, every ingrained fear of her childhood, rose up in a sickening wave. She flinched in his arms, a small, involuntary movement. His grip loosened instantly. He slid off the horse and then reached up to help her down. His hands were firm and impersonal on her waist. As soon as her feet touched the ground, her left ankle gave way with a cry of pain. He caught her before she could fall, his arm steadying her. Without a word, he guided her to the shelter of a rocky outcrop, out of the driving rain that had begun to fall. He knelt and gently touched her ankle. She hissed in pain, and he drew his hand back. His movements were economical, efficient. He ripped a strip of cloth from the bottom of his own shirt and, after carefully inspecting the gash just above her boot, began to bind the wound. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. He worked in complete silence. Clara watched him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. This man, one of the people she had been taught to hate and fear, one of the savages her father swore to eradicate, had just ridden into a deadly flood to save her life. He was tending to her injury with a quiet care she had not known in years. Nothing made sense. When he was finished, he stood up, his height casting a long shadow even in the gloom. He looked at her ankle, then at her face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It felt like a wholly inadequate thing to say. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned, walked to his horse, and swung himself into the saddle. He didn't look back. He simply urged the horse forward and disappeared into the gray curtain of rain, as suddenly and silently as he had appeared. Clara was left alone on the muddy bank, shivering and in pain, the roaring of the floodwaters echoing the turmoil in her heart. She stared after him, at the empty space where he had been, her gratitude a strange and bewildering ache in her chest. The walk back to the ranch was a long and painful ordeal. By the time the familiar shapes of the barn and the house emerged from the twilight, she was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and limping heavily. The ranch hands who saw her rushed out, their faces a mixture of alarm and relief. Her father met her at the door. His face, usually a stony mask of command, was tight with a fear he quickly concealed with anger. "Where in God's name have you been? The wagon?" "The arroyo," she stammered, leaning against the doorframe for support. "There was a flood. The wagon. It's gone. Daisy, too." The loss of the faithful old mare struck her then, a fresh pang of grief. His eyes swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the mud, the makeshift bandage on her ankle. "You are hurt." "It's not so bad," she said, trying to straighten up. He helped her inside, his touch rough but not unkind. He settled her in a chair by the cold hearth and examined her ankle himself. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous as he looked at the strip of dark, wet cloth. "Who wrapped this?" Clara hesitated. The truth felt like a betrayal, though she was not sure of whom. "A man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He pulled me from the water." "What man? One of my men?" She shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. "No, a stranger. He was just passing by." Her father's gaze narrowed. He was a man who had spent a lifetime interrogating soldiers and prisoners. He could smell a lie, or an omission, like smoke on the wind. He studied the cloth again. It was not the kind of homespun fabric the settlers used. It was something else. "What did he look like?" he demanded. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "It was raining. I could not see him well. Tall. He was on a dark horse." He was silent for a long time, his eyes boring into her. She felt pinned by his suspicion. Finally, he stood up. "I will send a few men to look for the wagon in the morning. And the mare, get yourself cleaned up. Martha will bring you something hot." He turned to leave the room, but paused in the doorway. "Clara," he said, his back still to her, "if this stranger was not a white man, you will tell me. You understand?" "He saved my life, Father," she said, a new and unfamiliar defiance rising in her. He turned then, and the look on his face silenced her. It was the same fire she had seen before, but now it was directed at her. "They are clever. They lure you in with a kindness that is just a lie. They are not like us. Stay away from their kind. That is an order." He left her there, his words hanging in the air like a sentence. In the days that followed, Clara's ankle began to heal, but the confusion in her mind only deepened. She moved through her chores in a fog, her thoughts constantly returning to the man in the arroyo, his quiet strength, the feel of his arm around her waist, the profound stillness in his dark eyes. She replayed the rescue over and over, trying to reconcile the man who had saved her with the monster of her father's stories. They could not be the same. She began to ask questions, careful, quiet questions that she hoped would go unnoticed. She asked the ranch cook, an old black woman named Martha who had been with the family for years, if she knew of any Apache who lived alone, separate from the tribes. Martha just shook her head, her eyes full of a warning Clara did not understand, and told her to put such foolishness out of her head. In town, she tried to be subtle. While picking up supplies, she mentioned the flood to Mr. Henderson, saying she'd heard a lone rider had been in the area. The storekeeper's friendly demeanor chilled. "Lone riders out that way ain't the sort you want to be meeting, Miss Hartwell. Best you stay close to home." Whispers followed her down the main street, the townsfolk glancing at her then looking away, their faces closed and suspicious. Her father's prejudice was a sickness, and the whole town of Bristle Rock had caught it. Her father's warnings grew harsher. He saw the searching in her eyes, the distraction in her work. He forbade her from riding out alone, assigning one of the ranch hands to accompany her even to the vegetable garden. She felt like a prisoner on her own land, suffocated by his fear and his hate. But his restrictions only fanned the flames of her curiosity. The mystery of the stranger became an obsession, a single point of light in her gray, circumscribed world. She had to know who he was. She had to understand why he had done what he had done. One night, she waited until the house was deep in slumber. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the low groan of the wind around the eaves. Her father was snoring, a heavy, rattling sound from his room down the hall, moving with a stealth she did not know she possessed. Clara slipped out of the house and made her way to the stables. She saddled Juniper, a nimble young mare, her hands working quickly in the dark. She rode away from the ranch, keeping to the shadows, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't have a plan, only a direction. She rode toward the high canyons, the wild, untamed land that lay between the ranches and the Apache territory. It was a foolish, dangerous impulse, but she felt more alive than she had in months. She was half convinced she would find nothing, that she was chasing a ghost. And then she saw a flicker of movement in a moonlit clearing near the canyon's edge. She dismounted, tethering Juniper to a scrub oak, and crept forward on foot. She peered through a gap in the rocks. Below her, in a wide, natural corral formed by the canyon walls, was a herd of wild mustangs. They moved like quicksilver in the moonlight, their coats gleaming, and among them, on his own dark horse, was a single rider. It was him. He moved with an impossible grace, his horse weaving through the herd without a sound. He held a lasso, its coils loose in his hand. He wasn't chasing them, not in the way the ranchers did, with shouts and whips. He was dancing with them. He mirrored their movements, anticipated their turns, a silent conversation passing between man and beast. Clara watched, mesmerized. He was a part of this wild landscape, as much as the moon and the stone and the untamed horses. He cut a magnificent sorrel stallion from the herd, his lasso singing through the air in a perfect, fluid arc. It settled cleanly around the horse's neck. The stallion fought, rearing and plunging, but the man on the horse was its anchor, a point of calm in its storm of panic. He didn't fight back, just held the line, his own horse moving to absorb the shocks, until finally, the wild stallion stood, trembling but still. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had to speak to him, stepping out from behind the rocks. She started down the slight incline into the clearing. The soft crunch of her boots on the gravel was a cannon shot in the stillness. His head snapped up. In an instant, the calm figure was gone, replaced by a man coiled with tension. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. His eyes, narrowed and hard, found her in the shadows. He did not look surprised, merely wary, like an animal that has scented danger on the wind. He ignored her. He turned his full attention back to the stallion, speaking to it in a low voice. The words a soft murmur that was not English. Clara walked closer, her steps slow and deliberate. She stopped about 20 feet away. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I came to thank you again," she finally said, her voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. He did not look at her. He continued to gentle the horse, his focus absolute. "My ankle is almost healed," she pressed on, feeling foolish. "The bandage, it worked well." He still did not respond. He was a wall of stone, a deliberate and unyielding silence meant to drive her away. But she had not come all this way, risked her father's wrath, to be turned back by a wall. She took another step. "Why did you do it?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Why did you save me?" He finally turned his head, his dark eyes pinning her in the moonlight. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a mix of accents, a cowboy's drawl softened by the edges of another tongue. "Go home," he said. "Not until you tell me." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face. "There is nothing to tell. You were in the water. I pulled you out. Go home." "People like you, people like me, we are not supposed to help each other, my father says." "I do not care what your father says." He cut in, his voice sharp. He swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and silent. He stood to his full height, and she realized he was taller than she had thought. He was intimidation made flesh, a man who belonged to the wilderness and all its dangers. "You should not be here. This is not your place." "And it is yours?" she challenged, finding a strength she didn't know she had. He took a step toward her, and she had to fight the instinct to retreat. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes. "You're crossing a line, girl," he warned, his voice a low growl. She knew he was right. She was crossing every line she had ever known. The line of her father's ranch, the line of her town's hatred, the line between her world and his. She was standing on the edge of a canyon far more dangerous than the one behind him. A single step could send her plunging into the unknown. Her heart pounded, a wild, frantic thing. He was telling her to go, warning her away. His eyes were hard. His stance was a challenge. Everything about him screamed danger. But she did not turn back, and he did not walk away. That night set a new, unspoken rhythm for Clara's life. Every few days, when the moon was a sliver or the darkness was thick enough to swallow a horse and rider, she would slip away. Her fear of being caught was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a pull toward the canyon that was stronger than reason. She was crossing a line, just as he'd warned, but she found she could no longer see the sense in staying on her side of it. He was always there. Sometimes he was working with the wild horses, his quiet patience a language they seemed to understand better than force. Other times, he would be sitting by a small, smokeless fire, his hands busy mending a bridle or sharpening a knife, his stillness making him seem like a feature of the landscape itself. For a long time, he treated her presence with a profound indifference. He would not look at her when she arrived, nor acknowledge her when she spoke. She would sit on a rock a respectable distance away, her hands clasped in her lap, and simply watch him. She brought him things, a loaf of bread, still warm, smuggled from Martha's kitchen, a jar of water from the ranch's deep well, colder and sweeter than the brackish water in the canyon springs, an apple for his horse. He never thanked her, but the next time she came, the bread would be gone, the jar empty. It was a silent conversation, a fragile truce built on small offerings. One night, she found him tending to a deep gash on his horse's flank. He was trying to stitch it with clumsy, shaking hands, his face tight with frustration. "Let me," she said, her voice soft. He grunted, a sound of dismissal, and continued to fumble with the needle. Clara moved forward, her shadow falling over him. "I have mended more shirts and stitched more wounds than I can count. Please, you are hurting him." He stopped, his shoulders slumping in a rare admission of defeat. He moved aside without a word. Clara knelt in the dirt, murmuring softly to the horse. She took the needle and gut from his hand. Her fingers were deft and sure, her stitches small and neat. He watched her, his dark eyes following the movement of her hands in the firelight. "It is a good horse," she said, her voice low and steady, meant to soothe both the animal and the man. "He was lucky you found him." "He was not lucky," the man said, his first unsolicited words to her. "He was caught in a rancher's wire." She finished the last stitch and tied it off, gently patting the horse's side. She looked up at him. "What is your name?" she asked, the question hanging in the quiet air between them. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire, his profile a hard, beautiful line against the flames. "Elias," he said at last, the name spoken so quietly it was almost carried away by the wind. "Elias," she repeated, testing the feel of it. "I am Clara." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I know who you are. You are Colonel Hartwell's girl." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation, a brand she wore that marked her as the enemy. "I am more than that," she said, a flash of her father's defiance in her tone. Elias looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back the layers of her polite upbringing and her sheltered life. "Are you?" he asked, the question a genuine inquiry. After that night, the silence between them began to thaw. It did not happen all at once, but in small increments, like a frozen river breaking up in the spring. He started to speak more, his voice a curious blend of the clipped, formal English taught at mission schools and the slow, easy drawl of the cowboys he worked amongst. He told her he was a breed, a man of two worlds and none. His mother was Chiricahua Apache. His father had been a white cattleman, a man named Silas, who had taken Elias's mother as his wife and then been ostracized for it. Silas had raised him, taught him how to read and write, how to break horses and track cattle. But Silas was gone now, killed by a fever that respected no man's bloodline, and Elias's mother's people, what was left of them, saw him as a white man. The white men saw only the Apache. "I do not belong to the fort," he told her one evening, his eyes on the distant horizon where the army post stood. "And I do not belong to the mountains." He gestured with his chin toward the high peaks that were the Apache stronghold. "So, I belong here, in the middle, with the horses." Clara learned that he survived by his skill. He was a ghost who drifted from ranch to ranch, taking on the horses no one else could handle. He worked for ranchers who were either too desperate or too pragmatic to care about the color of his skin, so long as he turned their wild stock into workable animals. He would stay for a few weeks, sleeping in the open, collecting his pay, and then disappearing before his presence could cause trouble. He was a whisper, a rumor, a necessary convenience that the very men who cursed his people were willing to employ under the cover of darkness, as he slowly unspooled the threads of his lonely life. Clara found herself doing the same. The canyon edge became her confessional, the only place she could speak the truths that were choking her. She told Elias about her brother, Thomas, not just the sanitized hero of her father's stories, but the real boy she had known. "He did not hate your people," she confessed one night, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He respected them. He told me once that the Apache fought so hard because they were defending their homes. My father heard him say it. He struck him across the face. After Thomas died, I think my father was glad he could finally hate them without his own son disagreeing." The words, once spoken, left her feeling raw and exposed. She looked at Elias, expecting to see condemnation in his eyes. Instead, she saw a flicker of understanding, a shared sorrow that went deeper than words. He began to share more of his own pain. He spoke of his mother, not as a victim, but as a strong, proud woman who had taught him the names of the stars in her own tongue. He told Clara how she had died, caught in the crossfire of a U.S. cavalry raid on their peaceful camp. He had been just a boy, hidden in the rocks by his father, and had watched the whole thing. He spoke of it in a flat, emotionless tone that was more chilling than any scream. "The soldiers said it was a victory," he said, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "My father said it was a murder. I learned that day that the truth is just a story told by the man with the bigger gun." He distrusted both sides with an equal, weary bitterness. He had seen the cruelty of the white soldiers and the desperation of the Apache warriors. He saw the hatred in the eyes of the settlers and the fear in the eyes of his mother's people. He had no cause but his own survival, No tribe but the herd of wild horses that offered no judgment. Only freedom. His life was a series of lonely campfires, a constant moving on before anyone could get close enough to hurt him. Clara felt a profound ache for him, for the boy who had watched his mother die, for the man who had no place to call home. And in her heart, a dangerous and beautiful thing began to grow. She no longer saw an Apache when she looked at him. She saw Elias, a man of quiet strength, of deep, hidden wounds, and of a profound decency that the world had tried and failed to beat out of him. "You are alive because of me," she said softly one night, her gaze fixed on his face. "That is what I think about. The flood. If you had not been there, I would be gone. And no one in my house would even know how to properly grieve me. They would grieve the idea of me, the daughter, the sister, not me." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You are the only person who has ever truly seen me, Elias, and you saw me when I was half drowned and covered in mud." A strange, unreadable emotion passed through his eyes. He looked away, toward the vast, star-dusted darkness. "Seeing a thing and holding it are different," he said, his voice rough. "You should not be coming here anymore. Clara." "This is the only place I can breathe," she whispered. His jaw tightened, but he did not send her away. The nights grew cooler as autumn laid its hand on the territory. The false peace of their secret meetings was a fragile bubble in a world that was growing harder and more dangerous. Her father's patrols became more frequent, more aggressive. He talked constantly of cattle being stolen, blaming the Apache for every missing head. Though the drought had made all the ranchers' herds thin, Clara knew it was a pretext. He was looking for a fight, for a way to pour out the poison that had filled him since Thomas's death. One night, she returned to the ranch later than usual. The moon was high and bright, and she had lost track of time listening to Elias tell a story about a clever coyote. She crept into the house, her boots in her hand, her heart beating a little faster with the thrill of her transgression. As she passed her father's study, she saw a line of light under the door and heard the low murmur of voices. She pressed her ear to the cold wood. It was her father and two of the ranchers from neighboring properties, a man named Jedediah Smith and another called Marcus Thorne. Their voices were low, whiskey-soaked, and sharp with anger. "Another 6 head gone from my south pasture," Smith was saying. "The tracks head straight for the mountains. There is no doubt who is to blame." "It is them." "All right," her father's voice rumbled. "They grow bolder. They think we are weak. They think we will do nothing while they steal the food from our mouths." "The army will not do a thing." Thorne spat. "They are content to sit in their fort and sign their useless treaties." "Then we will do what the army will not," her father said, and the cold certainty in his voice made Clara's blood run cold. "We have enough men between our 3 ranches. We ride at dawn. 2 days from now. We will follow the tracks. We will hit their winter camp in the foothills. We will take back what is ours and teach them a lesson they will not soon forget." "This is not a patrol, Colonel," Smith said, a nervous edge to his voice. "This is a raid." "This is justice," her father corrected him, his voice like iron. "For my son, and for every man who has lost something to their savagery." Clara backed away from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. This was not about cattle. This was a massacre in the making. He was going to ride into a camp, a winter camp, full of women and children, and unleash his blind rage. And Elias, he had mentioned that camp. He had family there, distant cousins, an aunt. He might even be there himself. The image of him caught in the path of her father's vengeance, of his body lying broken and still, flashed through her mind with sickening clarity. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed, her body rigid, her mind racing. She was her father's daughter, but she was not his creature. She could not let this happen. The next night, as soon as darkness fell, she rode like the devil was on her heels. She pushed Juniper harder than she ever had before, her own fear a spur in the mare's side. The wind tore at her hair and screamed in her ears. She had to find him. She had to warn him. She found him not at their usual spot, but further up the canyon, tracking a mountain lion that had been harassing the wild foals. He was crouched by a set of tracks when she rode up, and he rose in one fluid motion, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Elias," she cried, her voice ragged as she slid from the saddle. He relaxed when he saw it was her, but his face hardened again when he saw the terror in her eyes. "What is it? What is wrong?" She rushed toward him, words tumbling out of her in a frantic, incoherent stream. "My father, a raid, the winter camp, stolen cattle. He is lying. He just wants revenge. They ride at dawn tomorrow. You have to warn them. They will kill everyone." She was gasping for breath, her whole body trembling. Elias listened, his face a mask of stone. He did not interrupt. He took in every word, his dark eyes never leaving hers. The muscles in his jaw worked, but his expression did not change. When she was finished, a terrible silence fell between them, broken only by her ragged breathing and the lonely cry of a distant hawk. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of emotion. It was as if he had been expecting this news his entire life. "You have to go," she urged, grabbing his arm. "You have to stop them, or get your people out." He looked down at the tracks on the ground, then back up at the mountains. "I will send a warning," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed centuries old. "But I cannot stop your father. Clara, a man like that, full of hate, he will not be stopped until he is in the ground." The finality in his voice was like a physical blow. He was accepting it. He was not going to fight. He was going to send a warning and then melt back into the shadows, a ghost once more. And her father and his men would ride on, and blood would be spilled, and the cycle of hatred would continue. In that moment, all the unspoken feelings she had for him, all the fear and longing and desperate, impossible hope, coalesced into a single point of terror. She saw him as he was, utterly alone, caught between two grinding stones of hate, with no one in the world to stand for him. "I do not want you to die," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her fingers tightened on the buckskin of his sleeve. He flinched at her touch, a sharp, involuntary recoil, as if from a hot brand. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, she saw past his stoic control. She saw the deep, aching loneliness he lived with every day. She saw the boy who had watched his world burn. "Then you should not be here with me," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. His words were a warning, a truth as hard and unforgiving as the land around them. Being with him was a danger. It put her at risk. It put him at risk. It was a line that, once fully crossed, could never be uncrossed. She should have let go. She should have turned and run back to the safety of her father's house, back to the life that was expected of her. But she could not. Her hand, instead of pulling away, slipped down from his arm, her fingers brushing against the back of his. And still, he did not move away. He stood perfectly still in the moonlight, a silent statue of conflict and longing, as her hand found his. The hand he did not pull away was a brand of fire against her own. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the moonlight, a silent tableau of impossible connection. The space between them hummed with everything unsaid, every warning ignored, every line crossed. It was Elias who finally broke the spell. He gently but firmly withdrew his hand. The loss of his warmth, a sudden, sharp ache in the cold night air. "Go now," he said, his voice rougher than before, "before the sun finds you." He turned and melted into the shadows of the canyon, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his touch and the weight of the coming dawn. The ride back was a blur of frantic prayer. Clara pushed Juniper hard, her mind consumed with the terrible knowledge of her father's plan and the even more terrifying fragility of her secret. The sky was already paling in the east, the deep velvet of night giving way to a bruised, pearly gray. She was too late. She knew it the moment she saw the figure of her father standing on the porch, a rifle cradled in his arms, his silhouette a stark and unforgiving black against the rising light. He did not shout. His voice, when he spoke, was deadly calm, which was far worse. "Get down from the horse! Clara!" Her body went cold with a dread so profound it felt like death. She slid from the saddle, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. He walked down the steps and took Juniper's reins from her nerveless fingers. "Where have you been?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her wind-whipped hair, the dust on her skirt, the frantic pulse beating in her throat. I could not sleep," she stammered, the lie thin and pathetic in the clear morning air. "I went for a ride." "A ride?" he repeated, his voice flat. "Toward the canyons, toward them." It was not a question. "No," she whispered, but the denial died on her lips. He looked at her then, and the cold fury in his eyes was something she had never seen before. It was the hate he reserved for the Apache, now turned fully upon his own daughter. "You have been sneaking out for weeks. Did you think I was a fool? Did you think the whole ranch was blind?" He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. "Who is he? Who is the savage you have been meeting in the dark?" "No one," she cried, trying to pull away. "You are wrong." "Liar!" The word was a roar, the calm facade shattering into 1,000 pieces of rage. He dragged her toward the house, his grip merciless. "You have a stink on you, the stink of smoke and wildness. You have shamed this family. You have spat on your brother's grave." He threw open the heavy wooden door to the cellar, a gaping black maw that led down into the damp, musty earth beneath the house. The air that rose from it smelled of rot and cold stone. "You want to live in the dirt with them," he snarled, shoving her toward the steps. "Then you can start here." She stumbled, catching herself on the rough stone wall. "Father, please!" "You will stay down there until you have cleansed this filth from your mind," he thundered from the top of the stairs. "You will think about what you have done. You will think about your brother, and you will tell me his name." The door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. The heavy bolt slid home with a deafening, final clang. Clara was left alone in the cold and the dark, the sound of her father's receding footsteps a death knell for the life she had known. She could hear his voice, a muffled, furious rumble from the floor above, cursing the Apache, vowing a vengeance that now, she knew, included her. For 2 days, the canyon was empty. Elias returned to their meeting spot each night, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. The air was still. The rocks held no echo of her voice. She was simply gone. On the 3rd night, he knew something was wrong. Clara was reckless, but she was not thoughtless. She would have found a way to send word if she were simply unable to come. He suspected the truth. He had seen the way the colonel looked at him once, from a distance, a look of pure, undiluted poison. He knew the man's reputation. Elias had lived his whole life in the shadow of men like that. Anger, cold and sharp, warred with a primal fear for her safety, against his better judgment. He rode toward the Hartwell Ranch, a ghost moving through the familiar landscape that was now enemy territory. He left his horse a mile out and approached on foot, using the darkness and his knowledge of the land to move unseen. He circled the house like a wolf, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of her. The house was lit, alive with the movement of ranch hands. He saw the colonel through the study window, drinking whiskey with a grim set to his jaw. But of Clara, there was no trace. He crept closer, to the back of the house, near the kitchen. He could hear the low murmur of Martha's humming. Then, he saw it, the heavy cross-barred door to the cellar, a new, thick padlock gleaming dully in the lamplight spilling from the window. He understood at once, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. A raw, violent urge surged through him, to smash the door, to tear the lock from its hasp, to pull her out and ride away with her into the night. But he crushed the impulse just as quickly. He was one man. The ranch was full of armed hands loyal to the colonel. A direct assault would be suicide. It would not save Clara. It would only get them both killed and give her father the exact excuse he needed to unleash hell upon any native person he could find. Torn and seething with a helpless rage, he slipped back into the darkness. He could not free her, not like this, but he could not abandon her either. He would watch, he would wait, he would find a way. Down in the cellar, time ceased to have meaning. There was only the oppressive dark, the damp chill that seeped into her bones, and the scuttling of unseen things in the corners. Twice a day, the bolt would slide back and Martha would appear, her face a mask of sorrow. She would leave a plate of food and a pitcher of water on the top step and leave without a word, her eyes telling Clara that the colonel was always watching. Clara's defiance crumbled into despair. She huddled in a corner, wrapped in a single thin blanket, her body aching with cold. The raid, she realized with a sickening lurch, must have already happened. She had no way of knowing what had become of Elias or his people. The thought that he might be dead, that her warning had been for nothing, was a torment worse than the darkness. After what she guessed was the fourth day, a new feeling began to take root in the soil of her despair. A stubborn, desperate will to survive. She would not rot down here. She would not let her father win. She had to get a message out. Her only hope was Martha. The old cook had always shown her a quiet kindness, and Clara had seen the disapproval in her eyes whenever the colonel launched into one of his tirades. There was a strength in Martha that her father, in his arrogance, had never bothered to see. Clara began to cough, small, weak sounds at first. Then she let a rasp enter her voice, and she began to shiver, her teeth chattering, even when she was not cold. When Martha came with her food, Clara was lying on the dirt floor, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Miss Clara," Martha's voice was sharp with alarm. "I am so cold, Martha," Clara whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "My head, it feels like it is on fire." Martha's hand on her forehead was cool and dry. "You have a fever. You cannot stay down here. This damp will kill you." "He will not listen," Clara rasped. "He will listen to me," Martha said, a firmness in her tone that surprised Clara. "A dead daughter is no use to him." She left, and Clara heard her arguing with the colonel upstairs. The voices were loud, angry. Finally, the bolt was thrown, and two ranch hands carried her up the stairs. The light was blinding, a physical pain in her eyes. They deposited her on her bed and left, locking her bedroom door from the outside. She was still a prisoner, but now she had a window and a chance. Martha brought her a bowl of broth. As she leaned over to help Clara sit up, Clara pressed a tiny, folded piece of paper into the cook's hand. She had written it in the dark of the cellar, using a piece of charcoal she'd found, her words scrawled on a torn scrap of her own petticoat. "Canyon, Elias, he is in danger. My father knows." Martha's fingers closed around the note without a flicker of expression on her face, but her eyes met Clara's, and in them, Clara saw a silent promise. Later that evening, Martha spoke to her in a low voice while tending to her. "I knew Silas," she said, her back to the door. "The man who raised that boy. Silas was a good man. He did not see color, only character. This world was too hard for a man like that." She paused, straightening the blankets. "Do not you worry, child. Word will be passed. You just rest now. You will need your strength." Days passed. The fever, born of a lie, became a grim reality. The chill of the cellar had taken hold, and Clara drifted in and out of a hazy, feverish state. The storm broke on the third night after she had given Martha the note. It was a proper Arizona tempest, the sky splitting open with jagged forks of lightning, the thunder a constant. Rolling cannonade that shook the very foundations of the house. The rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. In the midst of the storm's fury, Clara heard a faint sound at her window, a soft tapping, almost lost in the roar of the thunder. She thought she was dreaming, It came again, more insistent. She dragged her weak body from the bed and stumbled to the window. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a shape on the porch roof outside. A flash of lightning illuminated him for a split second. Elias. Her heart leaped into her throat. He pried at the window frame with his knife, his movement swift and sure. The old wood gave way with a soft crack, and he slid the window open. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. "Can you climb?" She nodded, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, relief, and feverish weakness. He reached in, his strong arm circling her waist, and lifted her through the window as if she weighed nothing. The cold rain was a shock, soaking her thin nightdress instantly. He held her tight against him, one arm securely around her. As he navigated the slick roof, a rope was tied to the chimney. He looped it around his body, holding her with a grip of iron, and lowered them both to the muddy ground below. His horse was waiting in the shelter of the trees, a dark shape against the darker night. He lifted her into the saddle and swung up behind her, wrapping a heavy oilskin cloak around them both. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. He urged the horse into the storm, away from the ranch, away from her father, away from the life that had become her prison. Clara leaned back against his solid chest, overwhelmed by the feeling of his arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her back. The fever, the fear, and the impossible relief washed over her in a dizzying wave, and she surrendered to the darkness, safe for the first time in days. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. She was lying on a makeshift bed of pine boughs and dry hides, a rough wool blanket tucked around her. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the rough-hewn walls of a small cabin. It was a simple, one-room structure, old and clearly long abandoned, but it was dry and safe. Elias was sitting on the floor by the fire, his back to her, meticulously cleaning his rifle. He was shirtless, and in the firelight, she could see the landscape of his back, the smooth, copper skin stretched over lean muscle, the faint, pale lines of old scars. He seemed to sense her waking, for he stopped and turned his head. His face was grim, his eyes full of a concern that he could not quite hide. "You are awake." He stood and came to her, kneeling by her side. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead. His touch was cool and sent a shiver through her. "The fever is still high." He offered her water from a canteen, holding her head up so she could drink. The water was cool and clean. "Where are we?" she whispered, her throat raw. "An old trapper's cabin. No one has used it for years. You will be safe here." For the next few days, he nursed her with a quiet, solemn efficiency. He brewed a bitter tea from herbs he gathered in the woods, a remedy his mother had taught him. He hunted, bringing back a rabbit that he cooked into a thin, nourishing broth, which he patiently spoon-fed her. He changed the cool cloths on her forehead and sat with her through the long nights when the fever dreams came, his silent presence a steady anchor in her delirium. Through it all, he kept his distance. He touched her only when necessary, his hands gentle but impersonal. He slept on the other side of the cabin, a world away across the small room, his back always to her. She would wake in the night and see his silhouette by the dying embers of the fire, a solitary guardian keeping watch. His care for her was absolute, but it was chaste, careful, as if he were afraid she might break, or as if he were afraid he might. As the fever receded, leaving her weak but clear-headed, the distance between them became a palpable thing, a silence more profound than any she had known in the cellar. She felt his eyes on her when he thought she was sleeping, filled with a raw, aching tenderness that he quickly masked whenever she stirred. One morning, she woke feeling stronger. The sun was streaming through a crack in the wall, and Elias was outside. She sat up and saw him by the creek, washing the dirt and grime from his face and chest. He moved with an unself-conscious grace, a part of the wild world around him. The sight of him, strong and alone under the vast blue sky, filled her with a longing so powerful it was a physical pain. He had saved her. He had risked everything to come for her. He had nursed her back to health. And yet he held himself apart, locked behind a wall she did not know how to breach. That evening, as he handed her a bowl of broth, she looked him straight in the eye. "Do not leave me again, Elias," she pleaded, her voice quiet but fierce. "When I am well, do not just disappear." He looked away, his jaw tight. "This is no life for you, Clara." "It is the only life I want," she insisted. Her fever was gone, but she felt a different kind of heat rising in her, a desperate courage. When her strength had fully returned, she confronted him. He was standing by the hearth, staring into the flames. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. She stood up and walked to him, stopping just behind him. "Why will you not touch me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He did not turn. His whole body went rigid. "I have touched you. I have cared for you." "No," she said, stepping closer, until her body was almost brushing his back. "You have tended to me, like I was a sick horse. You will not look at me. You will not sit near me. You act as if I carry a plague." She put her hand on his arm. He flinched, but this time he did not pull away. "Why?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, strained thing, torn from some deep, hidden part of him. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a torment that stole her breath. "Because once I do," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I will not be able to stop." The honest, brutal vulnerability of his answer shattered the last of her fear. This was not rejection. It was restraint. It was a reverence so profound he was terrified of it. He was holding himself back not for his own sake, but for hers. She closed the small distance between them. Slowly, deliberately, she took his hand, a hand that was calloused and strong, a hand that had saved her life, and brought it to her waist. She pressed his palm against the simple fabric of her dress, holding it there, letting him feel the warmth of her, the gentle curve of her hip. "Then do not," she whispered. For a heartbeat, he remained frozen, his body trembling with a violent, suppressed longing. Then, with a low groan that was half pain and half surrender, his other arm came around her, pulling her flush against him, his head lowered to hers, and under the low, timbered roof of the cabin, with the sound of the wind in the pines outside, he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and a forbidden, impossible yearning. It was trembling with restraint, yet full of a passion that promised to consume them both. And in that moment, as the storm that had been brewing between them finally broke, everything changed. The days that followed were a dream lived on stolen time. The abandoned trapper's cabin, once a forgotten relic of a solitary man's life, became their entire world. It was a universe contained within 4 rough-hewn walls, a sanctuary hidden deep in the folds of the hills where the laws of Bristle Rock and the hatred of her father could not reach. The world outside was a fiction. The only truth was the scent of pine and wood smoke, the warmth of the fire, and the solid, living presence of the man beside her. They lived by the rhythms of the sun and the needs of their bodies. Elias taught her the secrets of his world, the one that existed between the fences and towns of the white men. He showed her how to read the stories left in the dirt, the delicate print of a doe and her fawn, the heavy tread of a bear, the furtive scratchings of a wild turkey. He taught her which roots were good to eat, which berries would sustain them, and which leaves, when crushed, could soothe an ache. Clara, who had spent her life managing ledgers and tending a neat, orderly garden, discovered a new kind of competence in herself. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused from gathering firewood. Her senses, once dulled by the repetitive drone of ranch life, grew sharp, attuned to the snap of a twig or the cry of a hawk. In turn, she brought a measure of softness to his hard existence. She swept the dirt floor with a branch of sage, filling the small space with its clean, sharp scent. She took his worn buckskin shirt and mended a tear at the shoulder with a needle and thread she had carried in a small pocket, her stitches neat and even. He watched her work by the firelight, a strange, unreadable expression on his face, as if seeing such a simple domestic act was a thing both foreign and painfully beautiful. Their food was, by the world's standards, stolen. Elias would disappear for hours and return with a brace of rabbits or a fish pulled from a hidden stream. One night, he came back with 2 chickens, their necks cleanly broken. He did not say where they came from, and she did not ask. They cooked them over the fire, the smell of the roasting meat a luxury so profound it felt sinful. They ate with their fingers, their shoulders touching, a shared, silent conspiracy of survival. But it was the nights that truly belonged to them, with the door barred against the darkness and the vast, lonely wilderness. They would lie tangled together beneath a heavy buffalo hide. It was here, in the quiet intimacy of the fire-warmed darkness, that the whispered confessions came. Clara spoke of the crushing weight of her father's grief, of feeling like a ghost in her own home, a pale substitute for the son he had lost. She told him of her loneliness, a thing so deep and pervasive she had not even recognized it until he had pulled her from the floodwaters. Elias, in turn, began to unpack the contents of his own guarded heart. He spoke more of his father, Silas, a man who had loved an Apache woman enough to be cast out by his own people. And he spoke of his dream, a secret he had likely never given voice to before. "My father," he said one night, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He wanted to buy land, a small piece up north, where the water is clean and the grass is high. He said it would be a place where a man's name mattered more than his blood. Elias fell silent for a moment, and she could feel the tension in his body. He had a jar. He put money in it, coins he saved. Every time he sold a horse, a little went in the jar, for the land. "What happened to it?" Clara whispered. After the fever took him, the men from the town came. They said he owed money at the general store. They took his wagon, his tools. They took the jar. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of old, settled pain. "I still think about it. The land, a place where no one could tell me to leave, where I could raise horses and not have to look over my shoulder." He said it like a child confessing to a belief in fairy tales. He had spent his entire life running, moving from one temporary fire to the next, and the idea of permanence, of putting down roots, was a dream so fragile he was afraid to touch it. "It is not a foolish dream." "Elias," she said, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. She felt the rough stubble against her palm. "It is a good dream." "It is a white man's dream," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. "A deed, a fence. My mother's people would say the land cannot be owned." "Perhaps," she said softly. "But a home can be a place to be safe. You deserve that." He turned then, and his eyes in the firelight were full of a raw, unguarded emotion that made her heart ache. He saw the belief in her face, the unwavering certainty that he was worthy of such a thing. And for the first time, perhaps, he allowed himself to believe it could be real. He pulled her closer, his mouth finding hers, and they made love with a slow, searching tenderness, a silent promise to build a home in each other, even if they had no other place in the world. Their happiness was a fragile, sun-drenched bubble in a world of sharp edges. They both knew it. Every day they spent together in their hidden paradise was a day closer to the one when the world would find them. The inevitable happened on a clear, cool morning. Elias had gone to check his snares, moving through the trees with the silence that was his birthright. He was near the edge of the woods that bordered the open range when he saw a lone rider. It was a young hand from a neighboring ranch, a boy named Caleb he had seen once or twice in Bristle Rock. Elias froze, melting into the deep shadow of a juniper tree. But it was too late. The boy's head had turned, his eyes wide with shock and recognition. There was no mistaking Elias's face. Caleb stared for a long, frozen second, his mouth agape, before he yanked his horse's reins and galloped away as if the devil himself were on his heels. Elias returned to the cabin, his face a mask of stone. He did not have to say a word. Clara saw it in the grim set of his jaw, in the way his eyes had gone flat and hard. "Someone saw you," she whispered. He nodded, already gathering their meager possessions. "A ranch hand. He will be back in town by noon. The story will be all over Bristle Rock by sundown." The story. They both knew what it would be. Not that Clara Hartwell had found shelter with a kind man. It would be a twisted, ugly thing. The colonel's girl. Run off with an Apache savage. Abducted. Bewitched. Ruined. The words would spread like a prairie fire, fanned by the winds of fear and prejudice. It was worse than they imagined. 2 days later, Elias risked a trip to the outskirts of a small settlement miles away, where he sometimes traded skins. He returned long after dark, the tension in his body so palpable it felt like a third presence in the small cabin. "Your father has put out a reward," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He would not look at her. He stared at the fire, his hands clenched at his sides. "For my capture, $500. He paused, and the next words fell like stones. Dead or alive? The world tilted. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to make a man kill his brother. It was enough to turn every stranger into a potential executioner. "He is making you a monster," Clara said, her voice shaking with a rage that was cold and deep. "A story for them to tell, so they feel righteous when they hunt you." "It is what they do," Elias said, his voice weary. "It is what they have always done." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a terrible, heartbreaking resolve. "You have to leave, Clara." "No," she said immediately. "Listen to me," he insisted, his voice low and urgent. "You can go east, to St. Louis, or further. No one knows you there. You have some money you brought with you. You can find work, you can start over, live a real life." "I will not leave you. They will not harm you if you are alone." He pressed on, his words desperate. "They will take you back to your father. You will be safe." "Safe?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "Safe in a cellar. Safe in a house where I am invisible. Safe in a town that would see you hanging from a tree and call it justice. That is not safety. Elias, that is a cage." She walked to him, her heart pounding. She put her hands on his chest, forcing him to look at her, to truly see her. "My life did not begin until I met you. Everything before was a shadow. I was a shadow." Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "You are my start over." His resolve crumbled. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with a silent, ragged breath. He held her as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. They both knew she was right. There was no going back for either of them. Their only path was forward, together. They did not have to wait long. The ambush came at dawn. Clara was woken by the frantic, terrified neigh of Elias's horse tethered outside. In the same instant, Elias was moving, rolling off their bed of hides, the rifle in his hand before his feet even touched the floor. "Get down," he hissed. A gunshot exploded, and the small window of the cabin shattered, spraying glass and wood splinters across the room. Another shot tore through the door, the bullet thudding into the far wall. They were surrounded. Elias crept to the window, peering through a crack in the logs. "A posse," he said, his voice grim. "Maybe 10 of them." He glanced at Clara, his eyes dark with a fierce, protective light. "There is a loose log at the back, behind the hearth. I can get you out." "I am not leaving you," she cried, her voice drowned out by another volley of gunfire. "You will do as I say," he commanded, his tone harsher than she had ever heard it. He fired a single shot through the window, and a man outside cried out in pain. It bought them a moment. He shoved her toward the back of the cabin. "There is a deep ravine that runs west of here. Follow it down. Do not stop running." He began to push at the log, and it moved, revealing a dark opening just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Outside, the men were shouting, getting bolder. He gave the log a final shove. "Go, Clara, now!" He turned back to the window to lay down covering fire. Clara hesitated for only a second. Then, an idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her mind. She squeezed through the opening, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not run west. She ran east, in the opposite direction, breaking from the cover of the trees into a small clearing, making herself a visible target. "Over here!" she screamed, her voice high and thin with terror. A few of the men saw her. Their shouts changed direction. "It is the girl! Get the girl!" She ran, fueled by adrenaline and a prayer. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind her. She was leading them away, giving Elias a chance. She remembered the landscape from her explorations with him. She ran toward a series of steep, rocky bluffs that ended in a treacherous box canyon, a dead end. She scrambled up the rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the men closing in behind her. She reached a narrow ledge and flattened herself against the cold stone, praying they would not see her. The men, blinded by their pursuit, rushed past her hiding spot and into the dead-end canyon below. She waited, her body shaking, until she heard their curses as they realized their mistake. Then she slid from the ledge and began to circle back toward the cabin, her mind a frantic mess of hope and fear. The silence that greeted her was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. The posse was gone, having given up the chase for now. The cabin door hung open, splintered and broken. She called his name, her voice a raw whisper. "Elias?" No answer. She found him 20 yards from the cabin, slumped at the base of a large pine tree. He had made it out, but he had not gotten far. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left shoulder and chest, soaking the buckskin of his shirt. His face was a waxy, unnatural pale, his eyes closed. "No," she breathed, the word a small, broken sound. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. "Elias, oh, God, Elias, please!" She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound, a useless gesture against the steady, terrifying flow of blood. His skin was cold and clammy. She leaned down, pressing her ear to his chest, and was met with a faint, shallow beat. He was alive. She broke then, the strength that had carried her through the chase, the desperate courage that had made her a decoy. It all dissolved into a flood of gut-wrenching sobs. She cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale face, certain he was going to die right there, in her arms, another good man swallowed by the territory's senseless violence. She had saved him only to lose him. He woke in the dead of night to the sound of her weeping. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light through the trees. His body was a universe of pain, a single, throbbing agony that centered in his shoulder. But the sound of her quiet, heartbroken sobs cut through the pain. He managed to lift his right hand, the movement sending a fresh wave of fire through his body. With a will that took all of his remaining strength, he cupped her cheek. Her skin was wet with tears. She gasped, her head jerking up, her eyes wide and luminous in the moonlight. "Found his—" "I am still here, Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracked rasp. The relief that washed over her was so immense it was dizzying. He was here. He was alive. She choked back a sob and leaned into his touch, pressing her face into his palm. He held her gaze, his own eyes dark with pain but clear and present. The danger was not gone. It was all around them, a patient predator waiting in the darkness. They were wounded, hunted, with nowhere to run. It could very well be their last night on Earth. She leaned down, her lips brushing his, The kiss was salty with her tears and tinged with the metallic taste of blood and fear. It was a kiss of profound and desperate tenderness. In that moment, with death so close it was a tangible presence, their need for each other, for the life-affirming connection that defied the chaos, was overwhelming. Despite the agony it caused him, he pulled her down beside him. There, on the cold, hard ground, under the silent watch of the moon, they made love. It was slow and raw and painful. It was an act of pure, desperate defiance. Every touch was a vow, every movement a declaration that they were still alive, that they still belonged to each other. It was a prayer and a farewell, a memory they were forging to take with them into whatever darkness came next, like it was their first and their very last night on earth. The world had shrunk to the space between one agonizing step and the next. Dawn broke not with hope, but with the cold, clear necessity of flight. They left the smoldering ruins of their brief sanctuary behind, moving southward under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Elias rode his horse, but he was not truly riding. He was a dead weight in the saddle, lashed to it with a length of rope Clara had salvaged. His body slumped forward, his head lolling with every jarring step the animal took. His breathing was a shallow, ragged sound, each exhale a small cloud in the chilled morning air. Clara walked ahead, leading the horse, her own body a symphony of aches. She had torn the hem from her dress to create more bandages, and the shorter skirt, now stained and ragged, made walking easier, but it was not enough. Her long hair, a constant snag on branches and a banner for any pursuer, was a liability. During their first stop by a meager, slow-moving creek, she made a decision. With Elias's knife, the one he kept honed to a razor's edge, she sawed through her own thick, brown braid. The strands fell into the dust. A soft, dead thing. It was a severing, a brutal shearing away of the girl who had lived on the Hartwell ranch. She tucked the shorn ends under a wide-brimmed hat she had found in the cabin, pulling it down low. In the murky reflection of the creek, a stranger looked back at her, a thin, grim-faced boy with haunted eyes. It was a fitting disguise. She felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer hers. They traveled for days, a slow, desperate crawl toward a border that felt as distant as the moon. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the brutal heat of the day in rocky outcrops or thickets of mesquite that offered little shade and no comfort. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he would try to straighten in the saddle, his voice a dry rasp. "Water. Clara, you need to drink." He worried for her, even as the life was seeping out of him, most of the time. However, he was lost in a fever dream, muttering in a mixture of English and Apache. His words a jumble of memories she could not decipher. She tended to his wound as best she could, keeping it clean with their dwindling water supply. But she could see the angry red that crept along the edges of the gash. The infection was taking hold. He was burning up from the inside out. Fear was her constant companion, a cold knot that sat in her stomach. But beneath the fear was a hard, unyielding resolve. She would not let him die. He had walked through a wall of fire for her. She would carry him through the desert if she had to. The border town appeared as a shimmering mirage at first, a collection of low, sun-baked adobe buildings on the horizon. Piedra Roja. It was not a welcoming place. It was a town that clung to the edge of the map, a haven for men who had reasons to be forgotten. The dust of the main street was thick, stirred by a hot, listless wind. Men with hard eyes watched them from the shaded porch of a cantina, their gazes lingering on Elias, on his dark skin and the blood-soaked bandage on his shoulder. Clara kept her head down, the hat shadowing her face, and led the horse through the street, searching for a place, any place, that offered shelter. She found it at the end of a quiet side street, a small, neat house with a profusion of bright red geraniums blooming in clay pots by the door. An old woman was sweeping the packed earth porch, her movements slow and methodical. She was Mexican, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, her black hair, streaked with silver, pulled back in a severe bun. As Clara approached, the woman stopped sweeping and simply watched them, her dark eyes missing nothing. The exhaustion on Clara's face, the way she led the horse with a desperate gentleness, the unconscious form of the man in the saddle. "Please," Clara began, her voice cracking. "He is hurt. We need a place to rest. I have money." She fumbled in her pocket for the few coins she had. The woman's gaze softened. She did not look at the money. She looked at Clara's eyes, and then at Elias. And in her face was a deep, quiet understanding of suffering. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice soft, her English accented but clear. "The sun is no place for a sick man." She introduced herself as Señora Montes. She was a widow. Her husband lost years ago to a cattle stampede. She lived alone, asking no questions, offering no judgments. She helped Clara get Elias off the horse and into a small, cool room at the back of the house. He collapsed onto the simple cot, his body limp. Señora Montes brought a basin of cool water and clean cloths. Together, they bathed his feverish skin. The widow clucked her tongue softly when she saw the wound. "It is bad," she said, her expression grave. "The poison is deep in him." Over the next day, Elias only grew weaker. The fever raged, and his moments of lucidity vanished completely. He thrashed on the cot, his strong body fighting a war against an enemy it could not see. Señora Montes did what she could with poultices and herbal teas, but they both knew it was not enough. "There is a doctor in the town," the widow said, her hands twisting in her apron. "An American. He spends most of his time in the saloon. He is not a good man, but he has real medicine." Clara knew what she had to do. Taking the last of her money, she went to the saloon. It was a dim, foul-smelling place, thick with the smoke of cheap cigars and the stench of stale whiskey. She found the doctor, a paunchy man with a stained coat and bleary, suspicious eyes, holding court at a corner table. She explained that her brother was sick, that he had a gunshot wound that had gone bad. The doctor laughed, a phlegmy, unpleasant sound. "A gunshot wound? Sounds like he got what he deserved." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the boyish clothes, the dirt on her face. "The kind of medicine a wound like that needs is expensive, very expensive." He named a price that was 3 times what she had. "I do not have that much," she pleaded, "but I can pay you what I have." He waved a dismissive hand. "Come back when you have it all, or find a shovel and dig a hole." Clara left the saloon, her heart a cold, heavy stone. She could not let Elias die. Not now. She waited in the alley across the street, her mind racing. An hour later, the doctor stumbled out of the saloon, drunk and unsteady on his feet. He made his way down the street toward a small office. Clara watched him go inside, and then, a few minutes later, she saw the light in his window go out. Her heart pounded in her ears as she slipped across the street. The lock on the office door was old and flimsy. She worked at it with the tip of Elias's knife, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The lock gave way with a soft click. She slid inside, into the darkness that smelled of carbolic acid and stale linen. She fumbled on the doctor's desk, her fingers searching for his medical bag. She found it, a heavy leather satchel. She did not know what she was looking for, but she took a small bottle of laudanum for the pain, a packet of powdered sulfa for the infection, and clean bandages. As she turned to leave, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. "And just what do you think you are doing, boy?" A lamp was lit, and she found herself staring into the cold, cruel eyes of the town sheriff. He was a big man, an ex-soldier by his bearing, with a bloated red face and a drooping mustache. He had clearly been watching her. He wrenched the bag from her hand and shoved her against the wall. "Thieving, are we?" he sneered. He grabbed the front of her shirt, and his eyes narrowed as his knuckles brushed against the curve of her chest. With a sudden, rough movement. He knocked the hat from her head. Her shorn hair, matted and uneven, was revealed. Well, what have we here? He laughed, a low, ugly sound. A little girl playing dress-up. He dragged her toward the door. I know who you are. The description came down from Arizona Territory a week ago. Colonel Hartwell's daughter, run off with an Apache murderer. He dragged her out into the main street, his fingers digging into her arm. We have got ourselves some quality here, boys, he shouted to the men lounging on the cantina porch. The famous Hartwell girl. He threw her into the dust. She landed hard. The air knocked from her lungs. I will be getting a handsome reward for returning you to your daddy, the sheriff said, standing over her. And as for your Apache lover, we have a special kind of welcome for his kind in Piedra Roja. A crowd began to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and menace. Clara scrambled to her feet, her mind reeling. He is not a murderer, she cried. He is a good man. He is sick. He will die. He will die. All right, the sheriff said with a grim smile. But not from any sickness. It was then that Elias appeared. He must have heard the commotion. He must have dragged himself from his sickbed with the last of his strength. He stood at the end of the street, leaning against the corner of a building for support. He was barefoot, wearing only his torn trousers. The bandage around his shoulder was soaked through with fresh blood where his wound had reopened. He was pale as a ghost, his body trembling with fever and weakness. But his eyes were clear and blazing with a fire that seemed to hold his broken body together. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk toward them, each step a visible, agonizing effort. The crowd parted before him, a low murmur running through them. He was a specter, a dead man walking, and there was something in his terrible, silent advance that commanded their respect. He stopped 10 feet from the sheriff, his gaze locked on Clara, a look of profound love and anguish in his eyes. Then he looked at the sheriff. Let her go, Elias said, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper, yet it carried in the sudden silence. The sheriff laughed. Look what the cat dragged in. You are in no position to be making demands, boy. Let her go, Elias repeated, taking another unsteady step. She has done nothing. It was me. I took her. Take me. The reward is for me. Let her walk away, and I will not resist. He was offering himself up. He was willing to trade his life for her freedom, right here, in the dirt of this miserable town. The sheriff's eyes gleamed with a vicious pleasure. Oh, I will take you. All right, but I think I will keep the girl too. A little extra bonus for my trouble. He drew his pistol. But first, I think this town could use a little entertainment. He nodded to one of his deputies, who threw a rope over a thick beam on the cantina's porch. They fashioned a crude noose. Clara screamed, No, you cannot! I am the law here, girlie, the sheriff snarled. I can do whatever I want. Desperate, Clara turned to the crowd, her eyes searching for a single shred of humanity. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. Help us. He is innocent. She saw Senora Montes on the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of horror, her hands pressed to her mouth. Senora, please! Clara pulled out the few coins she had left. Take this, all of it, just help him! The town was divided. Some of the men, the hard cases and cronies of the sheriff, looked on with bloodthirsty anticipation. But others, the Mexican townsfolk, the shopkeepers, looked uneasy. They saw a sick man offering his life for a woman he loved. They saw the sheriff's ugly, drunken justice. They did not see a crime. They began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices low and angry. The sheriff's men grabbed Elias. He did not have the strength to fight back. They dragged him toward the porch, the noose dangling before him. In the rising chaos, Senora Montes moved, with a speed that belied her age. She stepped into the cantina and emerged a second later holding an old, heavy shotgun. She did not aim it at anyone. She pointed it straight up at the sky and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening. It shattered the tense silence, sending birds screeching into the air and making the crowd surge backward in shock. For a single, crucial moment, everyone was frozen, their attention fixed on the old woman with the smoking shotgun. It was the opening they needed. Elias, using a surge of pure adrenaline, threw his weight backward, knocking the two deputies off balance. Clara lunged forward, grabbing the stolen medicine bag from where the sheriff had dropped it. "Elias, run!" she screamed. He stumbled toward her. She grabbed his hand, and they ran. They scrambled for his horse, which was still tethered in front of the widow's house. A few of the sheriff's men started to give chase, but the rest of the crowd, now a hostile, muttering mob, blocked their way, creating a wall of confusion and resentment. Another shot rang out, this time from the sheriff, but the bullet went wide, kicking up dust far behind them. Clara scrambled onto the horse's back and pulled Elias up behind her. He collapsed against her, his body almost completely limp. She dug her heels into the horse's sides and they galloped out of town, heading south into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the desert, with the shouts of a newly formed posse already rising behind them. They rode hard for hours, pushing the horse to its limit. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers was a persistent, ominous smudge on the horizon. They rode until the horse was lathered and gasping, until the town of Piedra Roja was long gone, until the landscape had resolved into nothing but sand and rock and shimmering heat. At the edge of a range of stark, barren mountains, Elias's last reserve of strength gave out. He slid from the horse, not with a conscious movement, but like a sack of grain, and collapsed in a heap in the sand. Clara jumped down, her heart seizing with terror. She rushed to him, turning him over gently. His face was ashen, his lips blue. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were closed, and his breath was a faint, almost imperceptible flutter. The posse was still out there. They were alone, wounded, with no water and no shelter. He was dying. She cradled his head in her lap, her body shielding him from the relentless sun. The hard shell of her resolve finally cracked, and tears streamed down her face, falling onto his still, dusty cheeks. This could not be the end. After everything they had survived, it could not end here. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, her voice a desperate, tear-choked whisper. "You saved me," she said, her words a prayer to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. "From the flood, from my father, you saved me. Now let me save you." She kissed his forehead, his cheek, his lips, her tears a baptism in the dust. "Do not die, Elias," she begged, the words tearing from her soul. "Please, do not you dare die." Her prayer was a raw, desperate thing, lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. But something heard it. Perhaps it was the God she had forgotten, or perhaps it was the stubborn, resilient spirit of the man she loved. Elias did not die. He clung to life with a tenacity she had never witnessed, a thread of existence so fine that she was terrified a single harsh breath of wind might snap it. She managed to get him onto the horse, a dead weight that tested the limits of her own fading strength, and led them into the foothills of the mountains. There, she found what she'd been praying for, a shallow cave, little more than a deep overhang in the rock, but it offered shelter from the merciless sun and concealment from the posse that was surely still scouring the desert for them. Days bled into a timeless cycle of care and fear. Clara became a creature of instinct and fierce determination. She used the medicine she had stolen from the doctor in Piedra Roja, administering the powdered sulfa with a prayer and the laudanum with a careful, sparing hand to ease the worst of his pain. She cleaned his wound with water she found seeping from a rock face deep within the cave, a slow, steady drip that felt like a gift from the earth itself. She foraged, using the knowledge he had begun to share with her, finding edible roots and the tough, sour berries that grew on a hardy bush near the cave's entrance. For the first few days, he was lost to her, a body she tended but a spirit that wandered in the gray lands between life and death. She talked to him constantly, her voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet of the cave. She told him stories of her childhood, of the brother she missed, of the dreams she had once had before they were stamped out by duty and grief. She spoke of the future, of the land he wanted, painting a picture for him of a small house with a sturdy fence and a field of wild horses grazing in the tall grass. She was not sure if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, trying to weave a rope of words to pull him back to her. Slowly, miraculously, he began to return. The fever broke one night in a drenching sweat that soaked his blanket. The next morning, his eyes opened, and they were clear. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his cracked lips formed her name, Clara. The relief that washed over her was so profound it left her weak. She wept, not with the frantic grief of the desert, but with the quiet, cleansing tears of hope. As his strength began to return, the reality of their situation settled over them. They were fugitives, trapped between a border they could not cross and a territory that wanted him dead. The cave was a temporary refuge, not a home. They could not run forever. The world was not big enough to hide them. "We will keep moving south," he said one evening, his voice still weak but firm. He was sitting up, his back against the cave wall, his wounded shoulder tightly bound with the last of the clean bandages. "Into Mexico. We can lose ourselves there." Clara was tending the small, smokeless fire, stirring a thin broth she had made from a snake he had managed to kill with a well-aimed rock. She stopped and looked at him. She saw the familiar pattern of his life asserting itself. When danger comes, you run. "And then what? Elias?" she asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We run from town to town, always looking over our shoulder. We change our names, hide our faces, and live in fear for the rest of our lives? Is that living?" "It is better than being dead," he countered, his jaw tight. "Is it?" she challenged, setting the pot aside and turning to face him fully. "I have spent my whole life living in a cage I did not realize was there until you showed me the sky. I will not trade it for another one. A bigger one, maybe, but a cage all the same." He stared at her, his dark eyes filled with a pained confusion. "What else is there, Clara? Your father has put a price on my head. The law in that town tried to hang me. There is no place for us in this world." "Then we will make a place," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "We will not do it by running. We will do it by standing still." She crawled to his side, her hands finding his. "We go back." He recoiled as if she had struck him. "Back to Bristle Rock? They will kill me before I even reach the town limits." "No," she said, her grip tightening on his hand. "They will not. We will not ride in like thieves in the night. We will walk in during the light of day. You will not be a fugitive they have caught. You will be a man who has come to face them." "Face them with what?" he asked, a bitter laugh in his throat. "I have no weapon against that kind of hate." "You have the truth," she said fiercely. "And you have me." They argued for 2 days. He fought her with the logic of a lifetime of survival. She countered with the passion of a woman who had just discovered what it meant to be free. She told him that his dream of owning land, of having a home, could never be real if it was built on a foundation of fear. A man who is always running can never build anything. In the end, it was her unwavering belief in him, in the rightness of their cause, that broke through his defenses. He looked at her, at this woman who had faced down a flash flood, her father's rage, and a sheriff's posse, and he saw a strength he had never known. He had spent his life believing he had to be the strong one. He was finally learning that strength was something they could build together. The journey north was a slow, deliberate march toward a reckoning. They were no longer running from something. They were walking toward something. The change in purpose transformed them. Elias's limp lessened with every step. His shoulders straightened, and the hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a grim, steady resolve. Clara, for her part, felt a calm she had never known. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but it no longer controlled her. They arrived at the edge of Bristle Rock in the late afternoon. It was the day of the weekly town meeting, a fact Clara had counted on. The entire community would be gathered in the town hall, which also served as the church and the courthouse. They did not enter together. "Let me go first," Elias said. "This is my fight to face." Clara watched him walk down the main street. He was unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. His shirt was torn, his shoulder was still bandaged, and he walked with a slight limp. But he moved with the pride of a king. He did not look like a captured fugitive. He looked like a man who had come to claim something. Heads turned as he passed. The whispers started, spreading like fire through dry grass. By the time he reached the town hall, a crowd was already spilling out of the doors, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and morbid curiosity. He walked through the parted crowd and stopped in the center of the hall. He stood before the mayor, the ranchers, and the rest of the townsfolk, and simply waited, his silence more powerful than any weapon. A moment later, Clara entered. She walked to his side, and the crowd gasped. The colonel's girl, standing with the Apache, she slipped her hand into his, a simple, declarative act that sent a shockwave through the room. Her father rose from his seat in the front row, his face purple with rage. "Clara, get away from him! Have you lost your mind?" Clara met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear, only a distant pity. "No, father," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. "I have found it." She turned to the assembled town. "You all look at this man and see a savage, a fugitive, the monster from the stories my father has told you, but you do not know him. I do." She told them everything. She started with the flood, with the mysterious stranger who had ridden into a torrent to save her life when no one else was there. She told them how he had bandaged her ankle and disappeared, asking for nothing in return. She told them of her father's rage, his paranoia, his decision to lock her in the cellar simply for being curious about the man who had saved her. "He locked me in the dark and the cold," she said, her voice ringing with the injustice of it. "And this man, this savage, he risked his life to pull me out of that darkness. He took me to a safe place. He nursed me through a fever that would have killed me. He protected me. He honored me." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the silent, stunned faces. "You want to know about crimes? The sheriff in Piedra Roja tried to hang this man without a trial for a crime he did not commit, so he could collect the reward my father offered. We fled for our lives. That is the truth of it." She looked directly at her father, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. "My father calls me ruined. He says I have brought shame to our name by choosing to stand with this man." She lifted her chin, her grip tightening on Elias's hand. "If being treated with kindness is ruin, then I am ruined. If being loved for who I am, not for whose daughter I am, is ruin, then I am ruined. If choosing a good and decent man over a world of hatred and fear is ruin, then I am proud to be ruined." Her voice dropped, but it lost none of its power. "And I am not afraid of you anymore." A stunned silence fell over the hall. It was broken by a man in the back shouting, "She is mad! The savage has bewitched her!" Another voice cried out, "He is an Apache! He cannot be trusted!" The town was a powder keg, ready to explode. Some faces were hard with hate, their minds already made up. Others were filled with confusion, their certainties shaken. Many just stared, silent and uncertain. Then, a new voice spoke, quiet but firm. "He is a good man." All eyes turned to Martha, the Hartwell's cook, who stood near the back of the room, her hands clasped before her. "I have known this town a long time. I have seen the good and the bad in it. I knew Silas, the man who raised Elias. There was no better man in this territory, and Elias has his father's heart. He is quiet, and he has been hurt by this world, but his heart is true. A few other townsfolk, a blacksmith Elias had once helped when his wagon broke, a farmer for whom he had broken a difficult horse, spoke up, their voices hesitant at first, but growing stronger. They spoke of small kindnesses, of fair dealings. They were small cracks in the wall of prejudice. Just as the colonel was about to unleash another tirade, the doors at the back of the hall opened. A small, older Mexican woman stood there, her back straight, her face determined. It was Señora Montes. Beside her stood Mr. Henderson, the general store owner, looking nervous but resolute. "I have a statement," Mr. Henderson announced, his voice trembling slightly. "From this woman, Señora Montes of Piedra Roja. She has traveled 2 days to deliver it." He held up a piece of paper. "It is a sworn account of what happened in her town. It is signed by her and a dozen other citizens. It speaks of Sheriff Brody's corruption and of how he tried to murder this man for a reward, and how this young woman here was the one who was a victim of theft, not the other way around." He handed the paper to the mayor, whose face grew pale as he read it. The last pillar of the colonel's story had crumbled. This was no longer just the word of a supposedly bewitched girl against her powerful father. This was a legal document. This was proof. The town argued for an hour. The hatred was still there, a poison that could not be purged in a single afternoon. But it was now mixed with doubt, with shame, with the undeniable weight of the truth. Finally, the mayor called for a vote, not on guilt or innocence. Elias had broken no law in their jurisdiction. The vote was on the colonel's demand that Elias be arrested and held for the authorities in Piedra Roja, authorities who had just been exposed as corrupt. The vote was a murmur of ayes and nays. When it was counted, the nays were the majority. A current of relief and disbelief went through the room. They would not press charges. They would not hand him over. But there was a condition. The mayor cleared his throat, his face grim. "The people have spoken, but this is a difficult situation. There is too much bad blood here. As a condition of this town's decision, Elias must leave Bristle Rock. He cannot stay." It was not justice, but it was mercy. It was more than they had dared to hope for. Clara's father walked over to her. His face was a cold, dead thing. "If you leave with him," he said, his voice low and utterly final, "you are no longer my daughter. You will never again be welcome in my home. You will be dead to me." Clara looked at the man who was her father, at the stranger who stood before her, his heart so consumed by hate that there was no room left for love. Then she looked at Elias, who stood tall and free beside her, his hand holding hers, his eyes promising a future she had never dared to dream of. The choice was not a choice at all. "I have been dead to you for a long time. Father," she said, her voice soft with a sad finality. She did not look back as she and Elias walked out of the hall, into the clean, open air. The final scene was not an ending, but a beginning. They rode out of Bristle Rock on Elias's horse, with a second horse trailing behind, a gift from a few of the townsfolk who had been moved by their story. They did not have much, a few supplies, the clothes on their backs, and the small, hard-won purse of money Mr. Henderson had pressed into Clara's hand. They had no deed to any land, no guarantee of peace or safety. The world was still a dangerous place. They headed north, toward the high plains, where the sky was a vast, endless bowl and the land stretched out like a promise. Clara sat in front of Elias, leaning back against the solid strength of his chest. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close, his hand resting where her heart beat, steady and strong. They were scarred. They were exiles. But they were free, and under the open sky, with the wind in their hair and the whole world before them. They rode toward the edge of the horizon, together, finally. with no more lines between them. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.